So it's my very great pleasure today to introduce Professor Christine, or as everyone knows her, Cassie Kenney from Massey University in Wellington, New Zealand. Cassie and I have known each other a very long time, and we are very good colleagues and even better friends. We bonded over our love of trying to do research the right way with the right people, and have found much commonality in our values and how we do research. So very excited to have Cassie today talk about her experiences in the disaster research realm, where she now lives, from the perspective of Indigenous people. So Cassie, I'll let you further introduce yourself, but thank you very much and welcome.
So I would be disrespectful me if I didn't introduce myself in my own language. So, tēnā koutou kina tūpuna o te whenua, tēnā koutou kina rangatira, me tau whānau o tēnei wānanga. Tēnā koutou katoa, me haere mai, no mai, piki mai ki tēnei kōrero. In other words, greetings to the ancestors of the land, greetings to the leaders and the family of this university, greetings to all, and welcome to my little chit chat. I want to touch on Indigenous peoples' approaches, concerns, challenges, barriers in regard to responding to climate change quite broadly, but as a New Zealander, you probably see the odd Kenney slide pop in. But just a little bit of context. I don't know whether everyone realises, but Indigenous peoples constitute a community numbering between 370 and 380 million souls on the face of the earth. We retain traditional ownership of approximately 20% of all land above sea level, and that land contains about 81 to 83% of all biodiversity. We take protecting that very, very seriously, particularly as most Indigenous peoples commonly reside in sites where there is a lot of valuable natural resources, apart from those peoples that have been moved from their traditional lands for that reason. So one of the concerns going forward for nearly every Indigenous people I've engaged with is, how do we practice safe guardianship of our whenua, as well as the residents, the flora, the fauna that reside within them in response to the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. Right, I hope this works. It doesn't.
Oh no, not after all that.
No,
I'm gonna do this. I can take
yeah.
it.
We tested it, it worked, now it doesn't, so it's all good. So Indigenous approaches to climate change and disaster risk reduction. I was like, can we just push a button and make it go?
That's what we could do.
There we go. Apologies, folks, we tried. Our people have a long history of adapting to environmental and social changes. Historically, we've responded fairly rapidly by drawing on cultural attributes to support the wellbeing of tribal members and also wider communities, not just our own communities. And in this instance, it's our interrelated knowledges, values, principles, and practices informed by experience. We create evolving practice frameworks, cultural technologies, if you will, to facilitate coping with daily challenges and ensure community wellbeing in response to the progressive impacts of hazard disasters and in contemporary times, including those created by climate change. So I'm going to just put this little picture up. These are pātaka, they are traditional Maori storehouses. These particular ones are 220 years old, so they're a historical exemplar of how we protect resources and ensure food security from flooding. And there are various renditions of these sorts of storage houses right throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Stilts are a means of, in addition to addressing flooding issues, also addressing certain types of creeping fungoids, and also the ever-present rats. However, this is the past. The environmental goalposts have moved, and our lands and resources and communities are faced with cascading hazards. So this is just a little look at what the multi-hazard cascade that our Indigenous peoples are facing today looks like. And if you look at up here on the right and actually see the colour code, and it's a bit difficult to see, but the bulk of this is flooding, extreme weather, drought, extreme temperature, and wildfire, which indicates that the things that a lot of my science colleagues are most worried about, earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, are not going to be the big producers generally, although New Zealand's exceptions were all, of where the costs and the level of impact's going to be moving forward. And then we get on to disaster costs. So a team of scientists at Karlsruhe Institute in Germany did some, used cadet and did some risk assessment, and they calculated that there has been $7 trillion worth of economic damage and over 8 million lives lost since 1900, which is quite horrific. But what's worse is that we're seeing the costs and the loss of life increase exponentially. And then we get on to insurance events, and you can see, again, if we take these top ones, we have tropical cyclones, we have severe storms, we have flooding, and we have drought. And yet again, we're seeing it is climate change that is really the villain in the picture. So, Indigenous peoples are still using traditional measures to respond to these, but we're increasingly exploring the intersections between our cultural bodies of knowledge and science to develop new solutions. And I'm going to put up a few case studies for people to look at to give you some examples of the sorts of things that have been a source of interest. So, built infrastructure. Indigenous knowledges are reshaping what we know about what is safe. I couldn't resist this building. I didn't take this photograph, but the ones I took are crap, so I'll use this one. So this is the legislature building from Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. It was designed to be resilient for 100 years. I don't know whether, I know one person here has been up there, but anyway, Yellowknife is located about 250 miles south of the Arctic Circle. The building was built in 1993. It was designed with themes really pushed by Inuit and local First Nations. They did some of the fundraising for it and also were some of the key builders for it. So when they built it, it had a real, how do we look after the environment that we're building our building in? And one of the things that was an issue is that this particular area of the subarctic is it's remote, there's a lot of fragile plants and communities, it's rough terrain. You also had taiga, which is conifer-dominated subarctic forest, and tundra to consider. So when they designed it, they had to develop ways of putting the foundations in that took into account sensitive bog and boreal forest structures and ecosystems. And they did that. So I'm not an engineer, but I work with structural engineers a fair bit, and a couple of Canadian engineers have recently been involved in looking at buildings in the Arctic. And they did a structural analysis on this one, and they have said that it is actually, they believe, resilient for 200 years, which is making this building the most climate resilient building in the subarctic globally. So Canadians and Canadian Indigenous people should be very proud of it. Food security, another issue. So the Quinault is a Native American and a First Nation tribe. They have 3,000 kilometres of coastal land that they have traditional responsibility for. Razor clams has been a traditional food source, but has now also become over time an economic asset. And with climate change, the clam beds have been heavily compromised. Now, because it is a traditional food source, the Quinault elders crave it, and they get what is called clam hunger. And even though they know that clams are compromised with toxins, they still go and eat them and become sick, and in some cases there have been fatalities. So the Quinault, that below the border and also up in Canada, worked together, and they started developing traditional, with the macaw as well, I hope I pronounced that correctly, ocean acidification impact assessments. The first one came out in 2015, and then they collaborated with some of the other Salish nations to do climate change impact assessments. And one of the things that was really exciting is that it was a little bit like dominoes. Once they started, they could see the importance of community engagement plans, developing adaptation plans, looking at carbon dioxide footprint analysis and mitigation plans. The upshot of it was the plans that were developed drew on science, because they partnered with the University of Washington, and the University of Washington actually had a number of Indigenous scholars coming through from coastal nations who were part of that team. The resources they have developed are making a difference, and the adaptation resources have now gone right out through the Pacific Northwest to 84 tribes and nations, and made it as far as Utah's Great Basin, and they've been to the Ne per se. So the Ne per se took it, they have built on it, they've created stream temperature maps, because of course they're inland and they're looking at relevant to salmon survival in the Columbia River. And this has really been a domino effect in terms of First Nations and Native American tribes working collaboratively to support each other, sharing their knowledge, sharing their science, to develop adaptation and mitigation plans, and it's been quite a success. So let's go to Africa. So with the changing climate, we're seeing a huge range of areas that were traditionally quite dry being exposed to horrific flooding, and Indigenous peoples in this particular area have traditionally done very, very well. So Matabele land was always a very dry district, but with climate change, and a lot of it is rural, some agricultural, so flooding has been devastating for those communities. So one of the issues is that because Zimbabwe has that colonial history as Rhodesia, a lot of their emergency management infrastructure is very Western, they're very command and control, and there was a great deal of resistance to taking on board any of the Indigenous sort of knowledges. And when locals tried to explain to them about the Tombombo beetle, and that's not what its name is there, that's the name in Ghana for it, being a predictor of extreme floods, they said, "We're not interested. You're not providing us with evidence-based science, so we're not interested." So what happened was these communities partnered with the University of Zimbabwe to explore how Indigenous knowledge, because it's local and it's contextualised, could be validated in ways that would change the way emergency management response to floods rolled out. And interestingly enough, the traditional sources of knowledge around cloud patterns, wildlife activity, and plant growth that the communities relied on proved to be extremely accurate. Traditional responses, including setting aside raised land as evacuation zones, relocating livestock, using locally available resources, and response and recovery, proved to be completely validated by the research. So what we're seeing now is that the Zimbabwean emergency management system has actually taken this on board, and so now we're seeing a co-governed collaborative process towards emergency management, particularly for these particular areas that are really prone to floods, being introduced and supported by national government. I didn't put a country up here, but I think the Goan is a bit of a giveaway. So Aboriginal communities in Arnhem Land in Australia have used very small scale patch mosaic burning as an environmental management tool for thousands of years. They choose where and when based on Indigenous knowledge. It's about their experience and their familiarity with local environments. And that decides on how often they burn, how big a burn it's going to be. Now, up until about 4 years ago, the Australian Fire Service really focused on a lot more burns over much larger areas, and a lot of that was driven out of Canberra because there was a real resistance to taking on board Aboriginal approaches. And then they started seeing the results in smaller communities. And now the fire services in the Northern Territories and Queensland are absolute converts, not just because of the research my colleague Alec Bowman did, but because they've seen the effects for themselves. However, while we now have evidence that modern burning approaches increase the fuel yield of grasses, and we know that Aboriginal approaches actually not only decrease the risk of fires, but also reduce the risk of high fuel yield flora growing back, the fire service and Aboriginal communities are faced with serious political lobbying from the big station owners. So the farming lobby in Northern Territories and Arnhem Land is extremely wealthy. And what they've done is introduce a whole lot of low input, high yield grasses for their stock from South America that have got a fuel yield that is twice as high as the high fuel yield grasses that the fire service originally had to deal with. So while the recommendations are that contextualised implementation of Aboriginal burning practices best, there's a political war over whose voices are privileged being fought in Australia. And then you've got fighting fires with fire. So the Karok and Yurok tribes have been practicing controlled burns, pile burns to decrease fire risk for years and improve plant density and access to resources that are strongly linked with their identity, particularly the California hazelnut tree, because after it's burnt, the stems can be used as weaving material, and they make baskets, they make a range of other small containers, they make cradles, and the cradles have been quite lucrative, so they've got a cultural economy. One of the issues these tribes are facing is that so much of the land that they traditionally grew their hazelnut trees on has now become state parks in the US. So that means that they are increasingly being forced to find ways to keep this economy from which their entire communities benefit working. So they worked with Indigenous scientists from the University of California, some of whom actually whakapapa into these two tribes. Oh, sorry, I used the Maori word, who are members of those tribes. And that whakapapa is our word for genealogy. Anyway, they did a mass area of plots to look at different types of burning mechanisms, and they have found that doing it in the right way improved basket by 7 to 10-fold. So they're now instituting hazelnut growth in some of those areas and new areas that traditionally hadn't been areas where the trees grew, and they're putting the nutrients in, and it has made it's early stages because this is fairly recent research, but it's made a slight sort of increase in terms of economic wealth of the tribe. So, a lot of concerns for Indigenous people in terms of climate change and disaster risk reduction. You know, we're seeing environmental damage undermining community relationships, health and well-being, challenges traditional food security, erosion of tribal economies, cultural guardianship of lands and resources that is compromised. The other thing we're seeing is cultural de-skilling, which is because so many peoples have been moved from their traditional lands. We've seen urban migration, so we've got a reduction in the number of elders that have got the skills to pass on. Displaced community, loss of cultural identity and social tribal networks. And then there are country and culture related conflicts, and I don't need to explain the fallout from those in this room. Concerns for Indigenous communities is technological and social change. We're not anti it, but when you take a situation like global warming, where you've got increased fire hazards with extreme temperatures, in the Pacific, for example, as these two photos are from, you get seasonal changes. You know, thatch roofs get what they call mold thatch. It harvests pests and rats, so you've got issues, increased insects, so you've got respiratory, viral, bacterial, and vector-borne diseases in some spaces, and this is a result of changing humidity and changing climate. So there's a lot of donor aid in the Pacific that comes in, and they look at these traditional structures and see if we can do it better. So what they do is they replace thatch roofs with sheet metal roofs. When they're blown off and destroyed in high winds, they cause catastrophic injuries. It's one thing if you get whacked with a bit of thatch, it's another thing if a sheet metal comes through and slices through, you've rotted. And then when you take it to the extreme, you get absolutely disastrous outcomes. So these are photographs taken from where the village of Shaolin was in the Taiwanese hill country. So this particular village was home to two Indigenous peoples, the Piao and the Paiwan. There are still some left. They've been relocated by the Taiwanese government. This village that they built was relocated because the Taiwanese government wanted to move part of the river. So the newer part of the village was at a lower elevation, completely wiped out by a landslide that was created by Typhoon Morakot in 2009. The older southern part of the village was unaffected. Sediment had buried only part of the village. A few of the villages got away. They went for the old part up on, slightly up, but not that far. There was still landslide, and took refuge in the temple. There were 3 survivors who were rescued from the temple when rescue crews were able to get in. And one of the issues was that the Kishan River, which is down the bottom, became dammed because of the debris created by the landslide. So these are trees. This is a very powerful place to visit. These are trees, and there's 600 of them, and every single tree is for a lost family member. So, to add to the mix, Indigenous people are responding to climate change in a global context. So global context of climate change, disaster risk reduction is a number of key frameworks, and there's others, but I think these are probably the main ones. So the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction was signed in 2015 in Sendai, Japan. It outlines 7 clear targets and 4 priorities for action to prevent new and reduce existing disaster risks. And the big focus is reduce the loss of lives, protect livelihoods, try and ensure health or mitigate health risks. And they've taken a physical, social, cultural, and environmental sort of lens in terms of looking at people's assets, businesses, communities, and country. It expires in 2030. The Paris Agreement is one of a selection of the agreements. I think the first one was actually signed in Montreal in 1987. Then in 1992, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was created. And then following that, we got the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, which was about, anyone heard about emissions? There's a few nods. Okay, I'm not going to give you a lecture or test. The Paris Agreement is the most recent one, and they are talking about having another one, although the Paris Agreement's got a wee way to run, in November this year when they have the next COP meeting, which is will be COP27. Sustainable Development Goals, 17 goals, obviously global challenges. That inequality is a big one. There's specific mention in those goals of supporting and recognising the rights and aspirations of Indigenous peoples. And then this little one down the bottom is one that a lot of people don't know about. So this is the Global Risk Funding Facility. And it's set up between German and the UK government initiative with a bit of World Bank to support countries who have financial resilience to disaster issues. So that impacts a lot of the countries in the Caribbean have been able to access that. Some of the countries in the Pacific, some of the countries in Asia. But there are agendas running in that with regard to that. Now, it looks good on the face of it. You know, the Sendai Framework is on promoting inclusivity and diversity, Sustainable Development Goals. Paris Agreement makes mention of recognising Indigenous people's knowledge. But let's have a little bit of a look at the text. So if you have a look at this, government should engage with relevant stakeholders, including women, children and youth, persons with disabilities, poor people, migrants, Indigenous peoples. Do you see a trend here in terms of who's being positioned with who? And older persons, it's me, I guess now, in the design and implementation of policies. To ensure the use of traditional and local knowledge and practices is appropriate to complement scientific knowledge and disaster risk assessment and the development and implementation of policy and strategies. Adaptation action should follow a transparent approach, taking into consideration vulnerable groups, communities and ecosystems, and should be based on best available science and, as appropriate, traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples. So, the rhetoric is one thing, but in these texts, Indigenous people are finalised as vulnerable, Indigenous knowledge is subordinate to Western science, and the wording of these collective policy tools suggests Indigenous people's aspirations, knowledges, and climate change adaptation expertise have or may be silenced in policies as and when appropriate. So, significant policy tensions for Indigenous people, including we're looking at a policy shift in the UN from valuing to marginalising Indigenous actors' contributions and towards promoting technological advances. So, a few more Indigenous tensions to consider. There's evidence that Indigenous climate change, risk reduction and management approaches work. Policy uptake is going to slow and slower still now. There's a lot of non-acknowledgement or resistance to incorporating Indigenous value-based approaches into strategic climate change initiatives. There's also issues with level of fit with global climate change culture. Command and control infrastructures are very, very dominant. There's a real resistance and a real positioning of infrastructures and agencies as the experts. The flip side of that is that we get colonisation of Indigenous climate change disaster risk reduction through Indigenous knowledge appropriation. And I had a fascinating example of an American scholar from a very small college who sent me an email and said, I'm coming to New Zealand, I want. And he did a lot of upsetting things in the Maori community and then went back to Canada and said, how to address climate change, let's all go to the Marae, our Maori community centres. So, when etic individuals come in and appropriate Indigenous knowledge, they misunderstand it and then they misapply it, and that creates issues. Lack of Indigenous representation in policy sectors means that emic perspective is not there. It means poor knowledge, integration, interrelation into policy and practice. There's a flow on with Indigenous knowledge gaps and misuse in climate change infrastructures, preventing best practice responses to disasters. Delay also contributes to delaying communication engagement with Indigenous people and weather risk reduction management infrastructure. That's my new abbreviation. because it's all about the weather for us at the moment. No barriers. Then you add in the insurers and the reinsurers. And there's issues around Indigenous volunteering. When I started talking, I talked about the fact that Indigenous people take guardianship of their lands and all that's in it very seriously. When something really bad happens, we mobilise collectively really quickly, and we're out and volunteering and supporting our community. When you have interagency competition and conflicts with volunteers that are mandated, like Red Cross, and there's a range of other actors in the space, Indigenous volunteers get positioned. I've seen Indigenous teams have their satellite phones seized, resources taken, their knowledge disrespected. I've seen duplication, and I've seen areas where there were gaps because the Indigenous communities weren't allowed to go in and go to the areas where they knew there were people, whereas volunteers came in and worked off what was in the phone book to get a sense of who was actually living in the space. Then you've got donor aid practices and technologies. I kind of alluded to that earlier when I talked about corrugated iron roofs. And there's a lot of work in corrugated steel roofs. They come in, they bring new technologies, they undermine Indigenous climate change, traditional capabilities, and also you've got issues around financial accountability. So you've got issues around restricting welfare support, who can get it, and issues around the deserving versus the undeserving, concerns about creating dependency. All of these sorts of layers that make life difficult for traumatised communities. Then we have loss of elders. So you're going to lose everything. You're going to use climate change knowledge. You're going to have decreased climate change capability and passing on of skills. You've got vulnerability of Indigenous cultural assets. Not all communities operate this way, but in most Indigenous peoples that I've worked with around the world, when there is something terrible that happens on their land, they will move very quickly to try and support everybody there. So there are, in some communities and countries, social expectations of Indigenous hospitality. This creates costs. It's been a massive issue within New Zealand where very poor communities will give their last cent to try and support those that are impacted by a disaster in their area. But reimbursement processes with local and central government has always been agenda-driven, and it's been quite difficult. And I've seen it in several Asian countries. I've seen it in Australia. I've also seen it in parts of Africa. And then you have a whole different issues in some parts of the world with corruption, cultural conflicts, and of course racism. It's a pretty dire story. So what do we do to get it right? And I see I wasn't always grey here. Engaging Indigenous communities in climate change responses. It's got to be an all-of-government approach. It's got to be collaborative. It's got to be development of rights-based climate change and adaptation initiatives. For example, one of the tribes in New Zealand in the Wairarapa that's just been hit by Cyclone Gabriel, they literally own nearly 33% of all the land in the Wairarapa. That makes them a serious economic player, but they were marginalised. There needs to be legislated government recognition of culture-based climate change and risk reduction and adaptation. I'm incredibly proud to say that New Zealand currently has in Select Committee the Emergency Management Amendment Act, which officially recognises the role of Māori at every level of governance in responding to climate change. We have also got another new act, a new Climate Change Act, which has just come into being, and we are about to bring on board our new Resources Management Amendment Act, there is another act that's going to look at how we look at water in New Zealand. So we are seeing those sorts of changes. We need to create joint government community climate change partnerships and Indigenous engagement at every level. And those in any country where Indigenous communities have significant responsibilities for lands. Not an easy ask. Power's never given, it's taken. So I don't imagine it's going to be an easy journey, but it's exciting to see the Australian climate change strategy, the Aboriginal one, led by distinguished Professor Marcia Langton, the Provost from the University of Melbourne, who was Aboriginal, gaining significant traction under the Labor government there. We're making slow moves in New Zealand, as I said, although we've got an election coming up next month, and I suspect we'll be looking at a far-right government, but, you know, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Just we play the long game. There needs to be measures to mitigate appropriation and misuse of Indigenous knowledge, so respectful knowledge exchanges, and those are starting to be established. The Global Indigenous Climate Change Conference is being run online in November, and that I understand has been oversubscribed, and not just by Indigenous scholars. Enabling Indigenous communities to access appropriate sorts of resources when they need them and not making it difficult. So reimbursement when significant resource expenditure has occurred. And investing in workforce development, scaling up of community capabilities. We're starting to see that happen now. Finally, the one that is very problematic for some of the parties running for office in our election, collaborative governance frameworks for climate change, disaster risk reduction, planning and implementation. Our new Emergency Management Act has made provision for Māori governance oversight at every level, including right up a governance group sitting alongside the Chief Executive of our National Emergency Management Agency. It's been a huge business getting the legislation into the House. The Cabinet set up a ministerial committee on emergency management before my sins I got appointed to it, so it's been a very interesting experience being involved in writing legislation in a way that isn't too threatening for those that won't be keen to see what they see as one part of the community privilege over the other. New Zealand Māori are in a very unique place. We have a collective asset base of close to $70 billion and we're not going anywhere. So that actually, those assets have been mobilised in the past. In climate change disasters, they will be again, so it makes sense to have us in the tent, not out. So this is what happens when things work really well. So in 2019, we had a real problem with climate change related bushfires in the Nelson Tasman area. And what happened was the local Māori community partnered with the police, partnered with the New Zealand Fire Service and with government. And it was a fully coordinated response to the fires. The word over in the corner, it says iwi. Iwi is the Te Reo Māori term for tribe. So 3 tribal liaison police officers were nominated. That's Inspector Dexter Quaid in the corner. Next to him is the regional director of our Ministry of Conservation, Barney Thomas. And over in the far corner is Shane. But anyway, he was the director for the Ministry of Development for the Nelson Marlborough region. All Māori, all locally connected and all wearing relevant hats. And they worked really closely with the 6 tribes that are in the area. The tribes have a lot of resources in terms of economic resources, but they also have what we call marae, which are Māori community centres, and these marae mobilised a host of evacuees from into the valleys where, you know, a lot of stock had to be moved from and a lot of families had to be evacuated from. The main one was Whakatū marae. These other 2 were put on standby and eventually mobilised. And there was extensive Māori volunteering, including by Māori who lived in the area, had genealogical relationships to the tribes. So, how do we achieve this at the global, regional and local levels? I think it's pretty simple. These are photographs from the 2017 Edgecombe floods. That's Edgecombe. As you can see, it became a very wet little area. We are looking at re-evaluating past climate and change events in relation to the impact of Indigenous approaches to climate change, disaster risk reduction, practice and outcome. So we're looking at old histories of climate events and what lessons can be learned over the last 600 years, because Māori retain that knowledge. We're also looking at reframing responses through collaborative design and planning for future climate change risk reduction and adaptation initiatives. And this is an example. So this became the Māori controller for the emergency response. This is the regional Bay of Plenty controller. The two of them worked as a team, and their teams worked as a team. And if his team couldn't do something, her team could, and they did outreach throughout the Bay of Plenty. No one died. There were no serious injuries. There were no elderly that ended up with severe morbidity. And a lot of these streets were cleaned up inside 2 weeks. So, towards a climate change resilient collection of communities in the future is going to be about co-designing with Indigenous peoples for a shared, successful future. Indigenous aspirations and well-developed capabilities pertaining to climate change, risk reduction and resilience are exemplified in some of the case studies I've put up today, and there are many, many more. What I like is the fact that, for example, the case study from Africa, you've got a very similar sort of case study that I could have put up today from Pakistan. And interestingly enough, some of those fauna are migratory. So the birds that they use in Africa at a certain time of year, they're also used in Pakistan for the same reason. Increased engagement with Indigenous people and investment in initiatives that build understanding of Indigenous culture, like this amazing building, which is not finished yet, but well on its way, as well as understanding of identity and place-based strengths. These are the sorts of learnings we need to take on board, because they are going to usefully inform comprehensive and collaborative adaptation to the extreme weather events we're all going to be faced with in the future. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Thank you.
I wanted to thank everyone very much for coming, and thank you so much, Cassie, for starting an important conversation that I think we need to continue about, especially in the context of climate change and disasters, because it's certainly become more evident every year that that is something that is only going to continue to get more prevalent in our lives and not less. So thank you all very much.